the news.
Hi, I'm Tessa with Brainrot News, with a few bits of news for you to choke on from March 30th. Russia continued its grand tradition of war crimes this week, launching drone strikes on Kharkiv. They hit a military hospital, a shopping center, and residential buildings, because apparently the concept of military targets is just a suggestion now. 2 people were killed and dozens were injured, including wounded Ukrainian soldiers who had already done their time on the battlefield but still weren't safe from Russian missiles. President Zelensky condemned the attacks, once again stating the painfully obvious. Russia has no interest in ending this war, only in stretching it out like a cat batting around a half-dead mouse. Meanwhile, over in the US, President Trump, the ever hard-nosed statesman, took a break from his usual schedule of rage posting and courtroom visits to scold Putin, not for the attacks, but because he wasn't being nice to Zelensky, saying that he was angry that Putin attacked Zelensky's credibility. In what can only be described as a masterclass in meaningless threats, Trump hinted at possible sanctions if Putin doesn't agree to peace. Because nothing intimidates a dictator like the hypothetical inconvenience of a slightly higher export tax. It's like watching a mall security guard wag his finger at a shoplifter while holding the door open for them. And of course, Trump made sure to emphasize that despite all this, his very special relationship with Putin remains intact. Because when the world is on fire, Trump is less concerned with grabbing the extinguisher and more worried about making sure the arsonist still saves him a seat at dinner. Iran has officially responded to Trump's diplomatic heartfelt outreach by slamming the door and bolting it shut. President Messieurs rejected Trump's request for direct nuclear negotiations, instead offering maybe, but only if you ask through a responsible adult. Given the US's track record of signing deals and then setting them on fire, Iran's skepticism makes perfect sense. After all, the last time Iran sat down with America in good faith, it got the 2015 nuclear deal, only to have Trump rip it up and toss it into the geopolitical garbage disposal. Since then, his administration has done everything short of mailing Iran a breakup mixtape titled Sanctions and Sabotage. So when Iran says the US needs to prove it can actually keep its word, it's not exactly asking something unreasonable. Meanwhile, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei reaffirmed his stance that direct talks with the US are about as wise as sticking a fork in an electrical socket. And with Trump steering America's foreign policy like a drunk teenager playing chicken in his dad's car, he's got a point. So how did Trump handle this rejection? Did he attempt a more measured approach, offer a compromise? Of course not. Instead, what he did was what he does best: threaten unprecedented military action. Because in his mind, diplomacy isn't about finding solutions, it's about forcing submission. If negotiations fail, just raise the stakes and see who blinks first. The problem is when you treat diplomacy like a game of chicken. It works great right up until someone doesn't swerve. And considering Trump is just the kind of guy who'd rather drive full speed off of a cliff than admit he was wrong, the rest of the world just gets to watch and hope he doesn't take everyone else down with him. Donald Trump is once again floating the idea of liberating Greenland, whether it wants to be or not. After failing to buy the island back in 2019, Trump now suggests that military force is a perfectly reasonable backup plan. Because why engage in diplomacy when you can just point a gun at someone and call it a real estate deal? Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen was, to put it mildly, not amused, calling Trump's rhetoric inappropriate between close allies, which is diplomatic speak for what the actual hell is wrong with you. But the Trump administration is doubling down, with Vice President J.D. Vance accusing Denmark of neglecting Greenland's security and suggesting that the US needs to stop it, purely for Greenland's safety, of course. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, who already had to humor Trump's first attempt to buy Greenland like it was a Manhattan timeshare, has reiterated that Greenland is not for sale, not up for grabs, and definitely not in need of unsolicited American protection. Meanwhile, Greenlandic leaders have formed a coalition explicitly rejecting US intervention, as they'd like to remain an autonomous territory rather than become the world's coldest military base. Copenhagen has now seen protests against Trump's absurd land grab, with Danes waving signs telling the US to back off. But in classic Trump fashion, rather than acknowledging that Greenland isn't a prize up for auction, his administration is rattling its saber and pretending that Denmark is the unreasonable one. Meanwhile, Denmark is still trying to be the adult in the room, offering enhanced security cooperation under the 1951 Defense Agreement, a reasonable attempt at addressing Arctic tensions without forced annexation. But Trump doesn't seem interested in collaboration when conquest is still on the menu, because apparently the lessons of colonialism weren't humiliating enough the first time. Nothing quite says freedom like the United States demanding foreign companies fall in line with its latest right-wing crackdown on diversity, and a move that perfectly captures the spirit of imperial micromanagement. The US Embassy in Paris allegedly sent letters to major French companies warning them that Trump's executive order dismantling diversity, equity, and inclusion policies wasn't just an American nightmare, it was their problem now too. France, being France, was not amused. Minister of Equality Aurore Berge accused U.S. diplomats of playing colonial overlord, calling the letter a diktat, which is a fancy European way of saying, "Who the hell do you think you are?" The letter, supposedly signed by a State Department official, instructed companies to certify their compliance with the new anti-DEI measures within 5 days, because diplomacy is a corporate loyalty test delivered by international mail. Predictably, the French government isn't having it. Many businesses are flat out ignoring the order because, unlike their American counterparts, they don't live in constant fear of Trump's next tantrum. Meanwhile, the US Embassy has gone radio silent on the matter, probably hoping the world forgets about it before anyone has to admit that strong-arming foreign companies into discrimination is a weird diplomatic strategy. So here we are, the country that never stops preaching about free markets is now telling foreign companies how to run their hiring policies, because nothing terrifies the modern American right like the idea of someone, somewhere, promoting diversity. If the Trump administration thought the French would simply roll over, they clearly forgot who invented the guillotine. Hamas has agreed to a ceasefire proposal brokered by Egypt and Qatar. The deal? Release 5 hostages, including an American-Israeli citizen, in exchange for Israel allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza, temporarily stopping the bombardment and releasing hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Seems like a pretty basic trade-off. Stop massacring civilians, let food and medicine in, and in return, hostages get released. But because Israel's leadership thrives on never-ending conflict, Bibi Netanyahu responded with a counter-offer. Netanyahu, ever the peacemaker, and by peacemaker I mean warmonger who dreams of an eternal state of war, insists that Hamas must disarm and that its leaders must leave Gaza before Israel even considers ending the relentless airstrikes. This of course translates to, we'll keep bombing until Hamas agrees to vanish into thin air and hand Gaza over on a silver platter. Hamas official Sami Abu Zuri called Netanyahu's stance a surefire way to guarantee the bloodshed never ends, which, let's be real, is exactly the point. The ceasefire phase, which began on January 19th, involved a hostage exchange and a temporary halt to the fighting. But surprise, Israel didn't actually stop its military operations, and as a result, the death toll in Gaza has soared past 50,000 according to the Gaza Health Ministry. So while negotiations drag on, Israel's been busy turning Gaza into rubble, killing civilians en masse, and making sure humanitarian aid remains a logistical nightmare. Meanwhile, families of hostages in Israel continue to rally, begging for a deal that actually brings their loved ones home. But Netanyahu, with his career dependent on maintaining a state of war, has bigger priorities, like keeping the military-industrial complex happy and ensuring his far-right coalition doesn't implode. Because strong leadership is when you reject peace deals so you can keep bombing a starving population while pretending it's all for security. Well, everyone, it finally happened. Dr. Peter Marks, the FDA's top vaccine expert and one of the last people in government who actually understands science, has officially resigned. Why? Probably because he's stuck in a never-ending nightmare where he has to fight against a man who thinks Wi-Fi makes you sick and vaccines are a deep state mind control plot. That man, of course, is Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who unfortunately worked his way into a government position despite being best known for tanking his own family's legacy by becoming a professional science denier. Marks, who was critical in the rapid authorization of COVID-19 vaccines, basically said, "I'm done arguing with a guy who doesn't even believe in reality." And honestly, good for him. There's only so many times you can hear, "What about autism?" from a guy who has absolutely no idea how vaccines work before your soul starts to wither. Though, unfortunately, this of course is a massive disaster for public health. The Biotechnology Innovation Organization is already panicking, warning that Mark's departure will kneecap scientific standards and slow down the development of life-saving treatments. Because it turns out when you let an anti-vax lunatic run the Department of Health and Human Services, Actual experts don't really want to stick around for the circus, and it is a circus. Just look at what's happening already. Mass layoffs in the department, vaccines programs getting gutted, and oh yeah, a brand new measles outbreak in the United States, and it's spreading across the country. That's right, measles. The disease we basically eradicated is now coming back because RFK Jr. has spent a great deal of his life convincing people that vaccines are more dangerous than actual deadly viruses. Let's not forget, this is the same guy who swore up and down during his Senate confirmation hearings that he wouldn't undermine vaccines. And that lasted about 5 minutes, because of course it did. His entire brand is selling conspiracy theories to the kind of people who think drinking bleach is an immune booster. Now he has real power, and instead of, say, using it to improve healthcare, he's busy undoing decades of medical progress so he can appease a bunch of Facebook moms and Joe Rogan listeners. At this rate, the FDA is going to be replaced by a wellness blog, vaccine mandates will be swapped out for essential oil recommendations, and we'll all be asked to fight the next pandemic with positive vibes and prayer. But hey, on the bright side, RFK Jr. and his followers will finally get to experience a world without modern medicine. Too bad the rest of us are stuck in it with them. Donald Trump is throwing yet another tantrum, this time at the Supreme Court, because the lower courts kept getting in the way of his dream of turning America into a dystopian hellscape. In just the past week, the Justice Department has filed 3 emergency appeals, bringing the total to 6 since the beginning of his second term. And what's got him so worked up? Well, the usual mix of xenophobia, authoritarian overreach, and good old-fashioned bigotry, of course. These emergency appeals cover a greatest hits list of right-wing fever dreams: stripping birthright citizenship, mass deportations, cutting federal funds for teachers, because why educate people when you can just feed them propaganda, and attacking transgender rights. Oh, and let's not forget trying to overturn rulings that have already smacked down his attempts to rewrite federal spending laws. You know, because the guy who built his entire empire on fraud and unpaid contractors definitely knows how to handle a budget better than the entire judicial system. Trump's legal strategy is simple. If a lower court tells him he can't do something wildly unconstitutional, he just runs to the Supreme Court like a spoiled kid demanding daddy fix it. And unfortunately, Daddy, also known as the ultra-conservative Supreme Court, has a history of indulging him. Back in his first term, the court granted Trump favorable decisions in 28 out of 41 emergencies. Compare that to Obama and Bush, who only bothered the Supreme Court for emergency relief 8 times in 16 years. Trump is on pace to shatter records, not for governing well, but for throwing the most legal temper tantrums per term. The latest cases include efforts to ramp up mass deportations of Venezuelan migrants. Because if there's one thing Republicans hate more than immigrants, it's immigrants fleeing socialism. They want to stop the reinstatement of fired federal workers, probably the ones purged for not swearing loyalty to the dear leader, and bring back his attack on birthright citizenship, because being pro-constitution is when you try to rewrite the 14th Amendment with an executive order. This isn't just about winning cases, this is about sending a message to the lower courts. Defy me, and I'll run to the highest court in the land until they fix it for me. It's a full-blown assault on judicial independence designed to intimidate judges into rubber stamping whatever authoritarian garbage he dreams up next. Donald Trump is back again, proving that his administration runs with the discipline and security of a group of teenagers making sure they don't lose their snap streak. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz accidentally added journalist Jeffrey Goldberg to a Signal group chat where they were discussing sensitive U.S. military operations against Yemen's Houthi rebels. That's right, the people responsible for national security are handling classified discussions with the same care as your uncle forwarding chain emails about chemtrails. But don't worry, Trump says it's fine. Waltz is fine, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is fine, nobody's getting fired, because nothing is actually ever a problem in Trump world unless it involves someone daring to hold him accountable. Trump brushed the incident off as a mere glitch, because accidentally revealing military strategy to a journalist is apparently on the same level as forgetting to update your iPhone. Democrats, and probably anyone who still believes in basic national security protocols, are pointing out that discussing classified information on an encrypted messaging app is the kind of amateur hour blunder that would have had Republicans foaming at the mouth if it had happened under a Democratic administration. But instead of acknowledging the recklessness, Trump assured everyone that his administration won't be using it very much anymore. Because that's how national security works, right? Just kinda not doing the thing that got you in trouble for a little while. And in a twist that surprised absolutely no one, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard refused to confirm whether she was using a government-issued or personal phone during these discussions. Because why follow security protocols calls when you can just shrug your way through a Senate hearing and hope people stop asking questions. Meanwhile, intelligence officials are scrambling to figure out whether any of the information in the chat is now considered classified, with CIA Director John Ratcliffe apparently deciding Pete Hegseth will be the one to make that call. In any functioning democracy, this would have been a massive scandal, with an administration so reckless with sensitive military strategy that they're accidentally inviting journalists into the chat. But in Trump's America, just another day in a government that's being run like a tech startup that's 3 weeks away from collapsing. Well, we're officially bringing back diseases from the 19th century because a certain demographic decided that science is just a suggestion. Texas, the land of freedom from common sense, has now hit 400 confirmed measles cases since January, leading the country in what can only be described as a preventable catastrophe. Gaines County alone is shouldering 270 of these cases, meaning it's basically become the Disneyland of measles, except instead of Mickey Mouse, it's just a highly contagious virus hanging around in the air waiting to ruin your life. And it's not just Texas. The five-alarm stupidity has spread across 5 states, with New Mexico reporting 44 cases and its first adult measles-related death. Kansas has 23 cases, mostly among, you probably guessed it, unvaccinated children. Oklahoma, never one to be left out of a public health disaster, has 9 cases directly linked to Texas. And Ohio, always a sleeper pick for where bad things happen, has 10 new cases in Ashtabula County. Health officials, who must be exhausted from explaining the basics of germ theory to a country that has Google but refuses to use it correctly, are begging people to get the MMR vaccine. But of course, thanks to the efforts of anti-vaccine conspiracy theorists, led by none other than Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., we now have a growing population of people who think overdosing on vitamin A is a reasonable treatment, but vaccines are a mind-controlled government plot. Meanwhile, the CDC has confirmed that 2025 has already surpassed last year's total measles cases, proving that when it comes to making things worse, America never fails to deliver. The thing about measles, besides the fact that it can kill people, is that it lingers in the air and clings to surfaces like a Republican clings to voter suppression laws. The only way to stop it is through herd immunity, which shockingly requires people to actually get vaccinated. Instead, we're dealing with a health crisis brought to you by the same crowd that thinks vaccines cause autism, but is totally fine with pumping their bodies full of horse dewormer and essential oils. So as Texas continues its proud tradition of leading the nation in things that shouldn't be happening, the rest of us are left watching in horror as a disease we solved decades ago makes a comeback because in America, learning from history is just another thing that died of preventable causes. The World Health Organization, the global body responsible for keeping plagues in check, is now facing a financial crisis so severe that it might even need a wellness check. Thanks to Donald Trump's masterclass in international sabotage, the US has yanked its funding because apparently punishing the world for surviving a pandemic is a top Republican priority. The result? The WHO is slashing 21% of its budget, because what better time to defund global health than when antibiotic-resistant superbugs and re-emerging diseases are making a comeback like a horror movie villain that just won't die. The new, leaner, significantly less effective WHO will be operating on $4.2 billion instead of $5.3 billion for the 2026-2027 period. And with budget cuts come job cuts, meaning the organization tasked with preventing the next global catastrophe is now offering voluntary early retirements to the people who actually know what they're doing. The WHO headquarters in Geneva is taking a big hit, as are programs around the world, because apparently healthcare is just another thing that needs subjected to the free market's benevolent wisdom. The WHO is now begging other countries and private donors to fill the financial hole left by the US, a hole that previously covered 18% of the WHO's entire budget. This is like setting someone's house on fire, then yelling at them for not having homeowners insurance. But of course, Trump's America doesn't do international responsibility. It's too busy banning DEI programs and trying to deport everyone who isn't white enough to pass the paper bag test. The consequences of these cuts will be absolutely devastating. We're talking about potential HIV treatment shortages in 8 countries, because apparently access to life-saving medication is just another thing that depends on the whims of American right-wing temper tantrums. Health services in Afghanistan, which were already hanging by a thread, are now at even greater risk. Let's not forget the dozens of other health initiatives that will quietly crumble because of this crazy decision. Final decisions on which life-saving programs will be sacrificed to budgetary doom are expected by the end of April. So if you were hoping for the WHO to lead the charge against the next pandemic, or address the rise of antibiotic-resistant infections, or just do its job, well, better hope some billionaire has a guilty conscience and feels generous. Otherwise, buckle up, because this is how you get a world where measles, polio, and new mystery viruses run wild, while the US pats itself on the back for owning the libs by making sure even fewer people survive the next pandemic. Donald Trump, the man who still can't spell hamburger, has once again decided that America's whole democracy thing is just a little too restrictive for his liking. Trump has openly suggested that despite the Constitution forbidding it, he's very interested in serving a third term, because let's be honest, once you've tasted authoritarianism, 2 terms just isn't enough. In a recent review, Trump claimed it was too early to seriously consider it, but definitely not too early to start scheming. One of his brilliant ideas, a constitutional convention which would require 2/3 of the US states to agree to rewrite the nation's founding document. That's right, Trump wants to rewrite the Constitution because if there's anyone who understands law and governance, it's a man who thinks the nuclear triad is a breakfast combo meal. This plan has a few minor obstacles, like the fact that 38 states would have to ratify the change, but that hasn't stopped his allies, like America's favorite fraudster Steve Bannon, from floating alternative routes. Bannon's genius idea? Having Vice President J.D. Vance win in 2028 and then just give the presidency back to Trump, because apparently laws don't matter if you just make them up as you go. Naturally, this casual discussion of dismantling democracy in real time has set off alarm bells for anyone who has read a history book not printed in Florida. Political analysts, legal scholars, and people who are still tethered to reality have pointed out that this kind of rhetoric is how you get a dictatorship, but Trump's base? Oh no, they love it. Nothing says owning the libs quite like openly advocating for the Putinization of America. Now you might be asking, what about Congress, the courts, the Constitution itself? Cute. This is a man who attempted a coup on live television and faced 0 consequences. He got a second term and he doesn't seem to be keen on ending it there. So here we are, Trump openly floating the idea of a permanent Trump regime and his allies brainstorming ways to make it happen. America's democracy has been walking on thin ice since 2016. The real question now isn't will Trump try to stay in power indefinitely, it's what and who is going to stop him. That's it for Brainrot News. Like and subscribe to watch as the world continues to burn while the powerful bicker over who gets to light the next match.